usually one of the questions of highest interest, shall we say. How do you, air quotes, do web archiving? What are the tools you use? How do you use them? And Archivit has been the most prevalent tool in web archiving, kind of as an end-to-end solution, or as much of a solution as one might get with web archiving at this time. So I've invited Karl to present on behalf of Archivit. He has a long history with Metro and NIARC and some other spaces before coming to the Internet Archive. So I might put him on the spot and ask him if there's any other details he'd like to preface his remarks, and otherwise just hand this over to you, Karl. Is that all right?
Perfect. Okay, so thank you very much. Thanks to Metro for having me back, and to Anna. It's good to be doing these again. I feel like it's been a little while, and I don't know if everyone in the audience has attended the prior modules, or if you're stepping in for the first one now. If you are, it's kind of a rare privilege to have Anna on the call. She's like one of the world's really leading experts on this topic. In the meantime, I'm going to kick things off with kind of a deep dive into one particular, as she said, software suite of different tools that put together are kind of a full end-to-end service, and that's Archivit. And she'll be back kind of in the back half to add to that some other tools and topics that can be complementary or instead of Archivit, or however it fits your needs. Those are my slides at the end of that link there, if you want to keep them for yourself or follow along from home, bit.ly/dowarc, W-A-R-C. But with that said, I'm going to do a quick overview of just kind of what the general process is for web archiving when you're using tools like Archivits, and then fill in the specific tools that one would use to match those parts of the process so you know how they line up. Towards the end, I'll point out a few things that kind of separate Archivit from other services, some additional features or functionalities that kind of make it what it is. And if there's time, if we're doing all right on time, I might just gesture towards a couple of things that are in development that might be of interest to you from more of a research and development standpoint, what's on tap for us. That means that some things that are kind of out of scope for us just today is there are lots of further advanced training on all of the topics that I'm going to cover, all of the different individual tools. You can follow the link from the slide there to Archivit's training on those topics when you're ready for them, and the kind of more curatorial decision-making that is covered thoroughly by this series, the kind of outside of the technology, what kind of policies or collecting decisions or appraisal decisions, quality and review, that sort of thing. That's going to be kind of for another day. But just so everyone's on the same page and we don't get too far out ahead of anyone, and this is your first time, when I'm talking about web archiving from now on, this is kind of what I mean. It's this process of collecting, preserving, and ultimately, if we're successful in our jobs, providing access to these materials that are published originally on the web, 1, 10, 5, hopefully 50 years from now. And each one of these steps has some technology that we'll talk about, some tools that are available on their own and in a suite like Archivits. It doesn't always look like this, but this is a pretty typical kind of schematic of a use case. It starts and ends with a person like you. Web archiving is talked about a lot in sort of automated terms as something that just happens, but really there's a lot of curatorial judgment and decision-making that goes into it. A person at a computer terminal identifies something on the web that needs to be archived. So for instance, saying I'm Metro's in-house archivist, for instance, I might want to archive the website as it looks today. I'm going to send a tool out there to grab it, typically called a crawler. There are some variations on this we'll talk about. But what that does is it accesses the website for me, indexes all of the content, links off into other pages, follows those, thusly kind of crawling the web and saving what it finds. Search engines use these same types of things all the time just to build up their indexes of what's out there. And the difference with a web archivist's crawler is that it takes that content and pulls it down most often into this internationally standardized format called a WARC, or for web archive. It's a file format, just like a doc or PDF or an Excel spreadsheet, only created specifically to house and contain the original contents of what we might find on the web with a little technical metadata that explains how to put them together. Because like all those other file formats, there are software that know how to open them up and show them to you like you'd expect to see from a web browser. So just like you would use Adobe Reader for that PDF, you would choose one of what we call a family of Wayback software to open up a web archive. It doesn't work just straight out of the browser yet. The probably still best known version of this, where you can see all of these pieces combined in one of those distinct Wayback access layers, is the Wayback Machine, the giant web spanning everything we can get collection that the Internet Archive hosts at that address, archive.org/web. There's a lot of automation included there. We try to get our crawlers as out there to the ends of the web as we can, and we've collected a lot in the process going back to 1996 and adding to that at a really good clip, still in the area of 1 billion unique captures each week. With that kind of corpus, you can find all sorts of interesting stuff. If I'm Metro's archivist, I might be happy to find Metro's website back in 1996. And a lot of variations of that, how it's looked in between. The major, of course, caveat being with this one be-all, end-all collection, that it's, incomplete. It's not perfect. It's generally, I describe it as it's not had enough librarians and archivists and people like you to really make it what it needs to be. It's what I call lightly curated, because we do try to decide what we need to spend our resources on when we go out and collect, but we are still kind of throwing paint at the wall to collect as much as possible. So it's not entirely complete. That is, just because I have Metro's homepage from 1996 in there, I might not have the contact page, the events calendar, or something like that. It's not cohesive temporally, that meaning I might not have these different web pages from the same time, and I might not have Metro's website archived on a regular, reliable basis, like once a year or once a month even. It's just kind of catch can. And with a corpus of that size, we haven't yet been able to fully really index it for full text search like everyone would expect from an access layer to the web, nor to really curate it into groups that you can browse through traditional metadata like we use to describe digital resources. You kind of have to know where you're going in order to get there. Like, I know I want to see metro.org at this time, and I can get there, but otherwise I'm kind of out of luck. There are, for this reason, this kind of these basic limitations, there has been a lot of tool development in this field going back, from the Wayback Machine's inception and before. There are parts of the process that you can pick up today and run yourself on your own computer, and I'll demonstrate a little of that, starting from capture, some tools that we developed at the Internet Archive that have kind of become standard now, like Heritrix and increasingly Browsler. Some things that don't create WARC files, but kind of scrape things from the web, like wget. You might hear mention of something called an ARC file. If you go back into the Wayback Machine collection, this is just a kind of predecessor version of the WARC before it got standardized and had a little bit less metadata for our purposes. Once in that format, though, there are a family of different software that can read the contents of those files and present them back to you. The Wayback Machine is one version of that with its own code base, but there are others that you can adapt for your own use, like Open Wayback, and some creative uses that are already on the web that you can view other web archives through, like Old Web Today, which I've already used in this presentation to pull up an old web browser. Thankfully, because we all live rich, full lives and have other things to do, there are services that kind of combine all of these things and give you a dashboard where you can run all these different tools at once and maintain them, because really just keeping one of these alive and working well and maintained can be a full-time job if you have a broad collecting scope. A lot of these software suites have been developed by national libraries in countries where you have a, what do they call it, kind of a copyright mandate, legal deposit, that's the one, where their libraries kind of have to collect this content. We don't exactly have that in the States, so we do have Archive It. That started in about 2006. There was 2005 into 6, there was kind of a critical mass of librarians, archivists, gallerists, curators of all kinds that said, we like what you have in the Wayback Machine, but it's not exactly what we need or when we need it, or we'd like to kind of run the levers and create our own web archives. And so we launched Archive It, which is a dashboard for all of those tools I mentioned and many more. gives you complete control over when websites are archived and how much of them. You can describe them and create curated thematic collections around your own chosen topic or domain. That does get also indexed for full text search, as we'll see. And there are additional APIs for all sorts of things on top of that, like moving the metadata out into other systems, moving the WARC files themselves, etc. And it's grown pretty geometrically since then, now passing 800. We'll get close to 1,000 partners, at least I think in 2021 by the end, and well over approaching 3 petabytes of data stored among all of these partners using the same shared resources, and it works. You can go there and see it right now, and what you'll see is something that looks like this on the left. Every partner in Archivit's kind of community, all of those 800 plus, can create portals to their web archives that look like this one, with a topic and a description and a list of URLs and where they came from and why they're important. And it's, for instance, been really effective in this last year for a lot of new partners to come on and a lot of existing partners to expand their collecting to include like material related to COVID-19 responses and resources. So for instance, the Schomburg Center here in New York can collect Google Docs and Sheets, which is kind of a specialty of theirs, around, in this case, supporting Black-owned businesses in New York City through the pandemic, and all sorts of other like kind of syllabi and group resources that are shared on social media. Let me show you what it looks like under the hood, though we'll take a live kind of tour through what this actually means to use and to create one of those collections. This is a live version of that same dashboard I mentioned. It starts with just a quick up-to-date summary of how much raw data you have collected in a year. Everyone shares our Internet Archive owned storage servers. So we do have to apportion out how much space everyone has to use in a given year, just to plan and budget accordingly. But it looks like Archivit is under budget, which is always good to see. And on the right, collections around a specific theme or topic of our choosing. And that can be anything that you want. There's no limit to the number or kind of collections you can have. Just need to give it a name and you're really off and running. So for instance, one of our just little pre-baked collections is on all things digital preservation. So if I select that, we'll start to see all of the real curatorial features and tools that Archivit offers. Again, starting just with a very basic overview of what's in the box, so to speak, in terms of how much in terms of data we're storing, documents, meaning really anything with a URL. So that's like a web page, but also any downloadable document, any image, any video. You can do some very high level things like make it public or private, meaning it is or isn't actually indexed on that public facing website. A lot of our partners keep their collections internal for just records management purposes or some embargo period before they can be public. There's no need to make them generally public like the Wayback Machine is. And what we call active versus inactive. And this is just an indicator of the automation here. You see down below, I've got a list, a cheat sheet, just to remind me of when I have web crawls scheduled to run automatically. Like I've got some coming up on my monthly schedule and bi-monthly, just so I can kind of put my feet up and let these things archive themselves. And let's see how that's actually done. So for digital preservation, for instance, I wrote a blog post here for Archivit. It's getting to be a while ago, almost 2 months ago, about a different tool. I don't know if Anna will mention or not, but YouTube DL. It's part of our stack. It's a specialty web collecting tool for audio video. It's kind of a deep dive, so I think this should be preserved, just so we have a record of this explanation of a digital preservation tool. I'm going to take its address here out of my browser, copy it. I'm going to put it in here under a list we call seeds. If you think of a website as having kind of like a tree diagram structure with a starting point and then a lot of stems and branches off into other areas, that's the thinking here. This is the point at which we tell that web crawler start here and archive everything you see. And likewise, where if we have a public collection, it's that list will be sort of the front door to the the general public on the other end. I can add to this list just drop in my new resource here. I can even decide I want to keep, well, maybe this just one site private for a little while or permanently. I can decide again whether I want it to archive automatically on a regular basis. This one I'll just collect once because I don't think it's going to change. This starts to get into the kind of varsity level running of the web crawler levers, but we can archive it like a standard typical website, page and everything that kind of nests under it, or say just one page. Just archive what you see at this URL. Good thing to do when you're archiving like a news article or a Wikipedia page or something where you don't want to get mired in all of New York Times or the Wikipedia or something. I can change all of that, all of those configurations as early and as often as I want to, but the key is we've kind of got it in a list now where we can manage it and we can deploy that web crawl, which is just as simple as selecting it out of the list and running a crawl. This link at the far right here will be our access point through Wayback. Since we haven't run the crawl yet, we won't have that there, but with another example, I can follow that to a simple calendar interface, which lists out literally every time one of those web crawls has been run. So I can kind of zoom back in time to see how that web page looked and what information it contained at that time. Slowly, you'll see this is loading now from our servers, wayback.archiveit.org, not the original. Even indicates what collection it belongs to and the date it was archived. All that information is up here in a banner that we add. Otherwise, it's a fully interactive digital resource, not a static snapshot. You can watch this collecting process, the web crawling, happen in real time here under the crawls tab. There's a ton of information there that's good to get familiar with when you're starting for the very first time to kind of observe and learn how web archiving works. But what I'm going to do first is actually pull back the veil here and go even riskier with my live demonstrations by showing what happens under the hood when we deploy a web crawl. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to run the tool that we use actually most to collect these things, which is called Browser. I'm going to pull it up on my computer. Just from the command line, I'm going to, let's go to my event folder here. I'm going to start my database. Good. And I think I still have this copied, but I don't know, I'll just copy it again. Make this a little bigger so maybe you can see it. And I'm going to tell Browser to queue up a new site here. Slowly. Very good. And start it running. This is how we launch the web crawler. Now what's going to happen is that's going to open up a web browser here on my computer to kind of do the archiving for me live, which we should see at any second. Oh, there it is. So no hands. This is Browser kind of working for me at my computer, finding the web page I want to archive and scrolling through it. It has been trained to recognize and perform normal user actions on a website, like click a play button on a video, navigate carousel menus, things like that. But once it kind of runs through, you can see what's happening over here on this side is it's live kind of writing everything that it sees, the kind of interaction between the server and the browser here, into one of those WARC files. So if I did this correctly, we should get a WARC file. Actually, that's going to be in my downloads, isn't it? Here we go. Right here is open. And even before that kind of finishes up and closes off, I can probably, this is just a version of a Wayback software. I'm running on my very own computer. I could turn off my Wi-Fi if I wanted to and pull up the same URL and see what it was like when it was captured today. This is all happening kind of behind the scenes on our servers in San Francisco Bay Area when you launch one of those web crawls with the archivist tools. Just a couple of other tools to be aware of because they're rolling out this spring. I mentioned that we have all of this material going back to '96 in the Wayback Machine. That material, increasingly, we can move that into archivist's curated collections. If, say, I signed up as an archivist partner today for Metro, and I said, well, you know, I'd like to start archiving our website, but I also like the backlog that you have. We can set up a pipeline for those works as well, so you have kind of the full picture and don't have to start with just today. The redirection service, which is kind of gets to one of the more, I think, useful purposes of web archives for everybody from a record standpoint. Before we get into the neat research stuff, is this is a service that tells basically an original web server when you want to serve someone up a 404 page because they're looking for something that's gone from the web, or it's not the same anymore. Instead, just redirect them to the archive. So it's a kind of way to seamlessly integrate between the archived and the live versions of a website so that someone doesn't end up at a 404 page and say, that thing that I needed is gone forever and I'll never love again. They can find it in the archive instead. And the example is from the National Archives of Scotland, because their records management and archives offices kind of combined, but they wanted people going to the old website and certainly links off of other web pages that still led there to resolve and show them something. So I think actually, if I just do a Google search for National Archives of Scotland, no, that's the new one. Oh well. Well, we'll go there straight. NAS. Is it NRS, the Net Record Service? Slowly.
Karl, I wonder with a deprecated site if they might have security errors in and of themselves.
Yeah, could be. Oh well. Loading too slowly as it is. We'll come back to that one. The reason that we can do this, though, is because everything that we build into the kind of fully integrated system that you see in this nice kind of slick dashboard view in a web browser is built on openly documented and accessible APIs, which if you haven't used them before, it's just a way of saying, like, the raw data at the back end, you can actually pull it out by writing your own code and just kind of referencing the data that we make available over the live web. Where those Wayback captures were made and when, all of the full text search indexes, so you can add that to your own website if you'd like something in addition to archivets. The WARCs themselves, somewhere between 10 and 15% of those 800 partners at any given time are duplicating the effort and keeping preservation copies of their own WARCs, the metadata that comes to describe them, and everything that's really in the web app view of things. So basic example being one of those archivist access portals with a topic. This is Princeton Theological Seminary's local churches. We can browse through or we can search. By the same token, they said, well, we kind of like that interface, but ours is better, and could pull up all of the same information without kind of doing it by hand every time, because they're pulling these titles, descriptions, the URLs for the sites themselves, even the search index straight from us. So with a little, like 10, 15 lines of JavaScript code in this case, they can get something branded on their own domain. Okay, so now's the part of the presentation where I ask Anna if we've got time to talk about a little bit of what's on the horizon and why it's so exciting.
Yes, please. And I see a slide that speaks deeply to me of significant properties.
Yes.
And thank you for checking back on the timing. So yeah, please go ahead and continue.
Real quick, because these are very in development, the emphasis is on those 3 stages that we talked about: the collecting, the storing, and then the representation through Wayback. Anna actually had one of the best descriptions of this issue of significant properties I've ever heard in the prior webinar. Do go back and check that out if you haven't already. But this is the way, it's kind of the cause of and the answer to all of web archiving's problems. Because the web is this dynamic and changing space that serves different content to different people, we have to ask ourselves in the process, well, what is it exactly that we're trying to collect and why? What is the meaningful information here, and what form does it have to take in order to kind of serve its need in the future? And a very simple example of that we're developing into practice is something like social media. Tricky to archive. We're always kind of in an arms race with the social media services to catch up with what they're doing and be able to archive it. In the meantime, other tools that might get mentioned in this series, like your social feed manager, allows you to do something a little bit different than creating WARC files, but pull out kind of the relevant data. And what you're looking at here, for instance, is just a spreadsheet of the National Records of Scotland's Twitter feed, which they said, let's pipe out all of the URLs, the textual content of that, even kind of links to the images if there are any. We don't really need to see the interface. What we want are kind of the facts or the information in bulk, which is good enough for their purposes because they want a record. And the neat thing about this is that once you do that, you've got this data in a form where it can be really remixed and used and adapted in some interesting ways. Like, we've developed a couple of new file formats and pipelines to create those that make web archives a little bit more lightweight and accessible. They can contain, for instance, just the page metadata from the live web, that kind of title and description fields, just the named entities using one of Stanford University's machine learning tools to pull out, as I did on the left, for instance, just all of the names of people mentioned in a web archive, in this case about architecture in Chicago. All of the images, you're seeing a kind of creative image gallery on the right of pulling all of the images out of the DC Public Library's punk rock web archive. We've developed a couple of file formats for that purpose. There's named entities, the metadata, link graphs, which is to say kind of showing a visual representation of which sites link to which and where, so you can get kind of a visual representation of traffic on the web. And it's kind of going from there. Those are kind of in development, as I said. I wanted to preview that because we're bringing on some new partners from the Archives Unleashed project who have been experimenting and kind of lab testing these things out of the University of Waterloo, and increasingly some new researchers and partners who want to use them to run some interesting research projects. So I want to know, certainly for our purposes going forward, if there are people in the room who have specific ideas about things they would like to learn from web archives, or forms that they would like to see them in that they don't yet see on the web or didn't see from that summary of archivist tools. Definitely let me know in the chat or questions, or directly. That's my email address, and the team at the Internet Archive if you want to follow up. But happy first to circle back and answer questions about any of those myriad tools I really just ran through very quickly. I'll mention, just because remembering it now, and I'm sure librarians on this call will want to know, the metadata on the website, that's done with Solr, and the search is Elasticsearch.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Karl. This is great. And as usual, I've learned a good handful of things about recent projects and what's going on. I keep pretty close tabs on this, but all the same, I always learn something in these presentations. Karl, thank you again. That was really excellent. So with the curriculum that we're doing with this series, I tend to repeat myself on some counts, and there's a reason for that. So I'll invite folks, if they haven't already, to look at the Introduction to Web Archiving recording. Getting Started with Web Archiving also is ready. I think I haven't reviewed it myself. And again, an enormous thanks to Karl and his colleagues at Archivit. It's really helpful to see what's available via their service at this point. So as a reminder, web archiving is more than the act of collecting. You have collection development and planning. You have the selection process, permissions, ethical review, considering, the larger implications of what you're collecting and why. Then there's collecting or harvesting, description, describing what you have, assigning metadata, assigning information so the web archives are discoverable. All of that is important. Access, so that replay piece that the Wayback Machine provides, and long-term preservation, which there are a few different approaches. So some of this is going to repeat what Karl has said, but again, like points that I think bear repeating. But the first thing I like to remind folks is that no one was born knowing a single thing about web archiving. And it's not advancing. Oh, I do want to just acknowledge some sources for this information I'm going to present, because I was not born knowing a single thing about web archiving. I started studying digital preservation in 2004. My first job in web archiving was for ICPSR, which is like a social science data a repository. That was in 2007. I took a web archiving class in 2008. 2013 to 2015, I was at Columbia to help start the Ivy Plus web collecting program. That is most notable because I had a lot of mentorship and learned quite a bit about Archivit, because that was the main tool for that collection. 2017 to 2019, I was at Rhizome trying to get a web recorder launched. I've been involved with the International Internet Preservation Consortium's Preservation Working Group for a couple of years, and then the Training Working Group for the most recent few years, since its beginning in 2018, I believe. So I've also done recent informational interviews over the past year, including folks at all of the institutions listed here. Old Dominion University, Michael Nelson, and his research partner, Michelle Waggle, they both lead really incredible web archiving work. I call them out specifically because Michael will be speaking on the next webinar on ethics. University of Waterloo, the Archives Unleashed was based there and is now going to Archivit to have a further, reach and kind of grow. I will not read this off one by one, but I do want to just acknowledge and thank all of the people I have spoken with. Another point for thanks, and again, I highlight this both because these are both incredible human beings, but also they bring a blend of expertise. And I think all of this is needed for web archiving, and we should remember that web archiving tools have a lot of requirements and bits and pieces that make them especially useful or sometimes lead them to fall a little short. The two people in question are Lorena Ramirez Lopez and Pat Shu, and I am especially glad to be working with them informally right now to talk about design, UI, UX, software development. Lorena's a trained developer. We're all interested in digital and new media, art creation and preservation issues. It is shared enthusiasm for metaphors and nerdy jokes, so on and so forth. But I think I will be mentioning them more over time, and I hope that folks will stay in touch with us as a group, because we do want to see more accessible and open tools that are made and maintained by a wider range of talented folks that are underrepresented in web archiving at the moment, and really finding a way to share expertise in web archiving beyond libraries, archives, and museums, and get ideas from all over. We also have this dream of having a Twitch channel for breaking web archiving tools and other commentary, so please stay tuned for that. I had mentioned in other webinars that there is a lack of ideal tools, and by ideal, we're looking for fully functional, easy to use, open source, sustainable, well-maintained, tested, widely accessible, and affordable with transparent pricing. Archivit is a lot of those things, and there are spaces for other tools and tools that can work adjacent to Archivit or meet some of the same needs in different ways. But when you're thinking about web archiving, if Archivit is not an option, or even if it is, thinking about what can we afford, what's good enough for now, what are we looking to do long term, why are we doing this, who is this for, how long are we looking to maintain and sustain this? And maintain and sustain, I'm hoping to hear that's 5, 10, 15, 50 years into the future, although some folks may have a lot shorter lifespan required for their projects. Crawler Spider Robot, Karl covered that being the software that traverses web pages to make functional copies. Human scale browser-based web collecting, I had really advocated for that very strongly when I was working with Web Recorder. I have maybe some more reservations about it as a process, but it is what it is. Seed URLs, again, being the starting point for collecting. And the WARC file being the ISO standard file format for web archives, I implore developers present and future not to ad hoc invent file formats. Karl mentioning the file formats at the end of his presentation, those are for analysis and specific kinds of projects, but they don't involve capturing web archives in an alternate format that is not sustainable or a standardized format that's been accepted by the web archiving community. So remembering that WARC files are really important is key. The fidelity, quality, similarity to the original, and significant properties Karl touched on as well. One thing that Archivist also has is quality assurance tools, which I think are very important and a missing part of a lot of the conversations about web archiving. But when you use free tools or more provisional tools, it's important to make sure testing fits into your plan of approach. But I want to just break down the different types and pieces of web archiving tools. So after this webinar, if you go looking for web archiving tools, you can kind of visualize where things fit together and what does what, because sometimes something will say, oh, it's for web archiving, but it doesn't really cover what part of web archiving, and it's again rare for something to do everything. So you've got capture, so making the functional copy of the web resources, quality assurance, assuring that you have what you want and what you thought you got, management and description for adding points for access. There's replay, browsable, so that coming from the concept of the Wayback Machine and that being a tool for making web archives browsable. It's not replay as in you hit play on a video and it runs a screen recording. This is fundamentally different. And then the preservation tool sets, what is making certain files preservation ready, so to speak, or long-term stewardship tools. And then there are also tools for analysis and interpretation. So we just covered actually replay, playback, Wayback Machine. So what do you want to do with your web archive? These, I think fit a lot of folks. There are always more possibilities, but things may be small, maybe a personal portfolio or an institutional collection. Maybe you want to do a text analysis or an analysis of media or images. Maybe you're a scholar of web history. Maybe you're a designer or an art historian interested in visual elements of the web, scholarly work, social media studies, web as history platform, et cetera, et cetera. The scope influences the tool. And I want to point people to the awesome web archiving tools list maintained by the International Internet Preservation Consortium, IIPC. And because we're running short on time, I'm not going to probably do a huge lightning round tool by tool, but I am going to introduce a couple more concepts. You have kind of your tools with a kind of user interface, and that would be Archivist. Conifers was an attempt at that, and has some features that allow that. There are also a great number of tools that the process starts with open the command line and. So when that is the first step, a lot of users kind of drop off because they don't feel terribly comfortable with that. And I think that's a space to grow. But it is important also to remember that user experience, and design, it's not a coat of paint on the code at the end. It really needs to be a dialogue between users and the designer and the developers as working together as a team. So the WARC file assumption. One question I've gotten about is, why is repository storage hard, like institutional repositories? And a big part of it is that replay functions are not built into institutional repository frameworks or other digital repository frameworks. So there's a little bit of a chicken or egg problem. How do you emphasize the value of web archives if they can't be opened and viewed easily? there's just kind of a circular problem there. Work files can be stored as, any other digital asset, but access and usage really are unsolved problems. Also, replay of work files, it's not a common feature of a lot of software. So it really is a need that I think could be met in more ways than it is currently being done. When you want to get started for free with tools in the web archiving community, it hopefully doesn't apply, the more contemporary adage of if the tool is free, you're paying with your data. Hopefully with web archiving tools, that's not true. However, you are potentially paying with your time and your expertise in terms of making use of the tools, testing them, ensuring quality, so on. I would give folks a heads up. Any marketing implying permanence is usually a pretty bad sign. Web scraping, you're getting bunches of the content for further use, but not necessarily a fully interactive web capture. Save Page Now, Karl has mentioned, it's free. It's a good way to make copies for future use and reference. Testing, I've maybe hammered this one a bit, but you get what you inspect, not what you expect. So move forward. Conifer is the current iteration of a tool I worked on called webrecorder.io. This has so much potential. In full disclosure, I did a lot of outreach and helped build a sustainability plan. That plan was not implemented. I would encourage folks to try these tools, but be realistic about the fact that you should be keeping local copies of your information. You should be testing the files to ensure you are satisfied with what has been captured. Web Recorder is a larger project, community calls, stay tuned. When I'm talking about reviewing your capture, this was a test that Pat Chu did today with archiveweb.page, which is a browser extension in Chrome made by Web Recorder. So this is your first view, this is your second, this is further. So this is I think your capture. So this is all you got of this Instagram page. And there were some, gaps and time lapses where it was unclear if the tool was working. So these are just things to keep in mind and keep an eye out for. With browser extensions, remember the browsers change. Will the extensions change and be kept up and maintained? These are important sustainability questions. As a field, I think we do have a lot of sustainability, maintenance, and precarity questions to deal with. We need more tools, better tools, and sustainable projects.
So thank you so much for joining us today. And thank you, Anna, for curating this wonderful series. I'm hearing such great feedback. And thank you, Karl. So great to see you again.